Hey, this is Brett, and you're watching Brett and Some Books. Today we are continuing the first Casualty by Philip Knightley. This is Chapter 4, Quite Another Game, 1899 to 1902. It was only Smith Dorrien's brigade marching into Bloemfontein, but if it could have been passed, just as it was, down Piccadilly and the Strand, it would have driven London crazy. Here are a clump of Highlanders, their workmen-like aprons in front, their keen faces burned black with months of the veld. It is an honoured name that they bear on their shoulder straps. "Good old Gordons!" I cried as they passed me. The sergeant looked at the dirty enthusiast in the undershirt. "What cheer, matey?" he cried, and his men squared their shoulders and put a touch of ginger into their stride. What splendid fellows there are among them! Here is one who hails me. The last time I saw him, we put on 70 runs together when they were rather badly needed, and here we are, partners in quite another game. Dr. A. Conan Doyle in The Friend, Bloemfontein, April 4th, 1900. The Boer War came to Britain at the high noon of her imperialism. The Victorian Englishman, excited by the lyricism of Rudyard Kipling, who captured H.G. Wells said, the very odors of the empire. It was the most patriotic citizen in the world. With honesty and partiality, he ruled the greatest empire the world had known. Only when his right to govern was questioned did he call in the army, and then, from the mountain passes of the northwest frontier to the upper reaches of the Nile, natives trembled at England's might. At home, few questioned force as an arm of policy, and there was none of that searching of conscience on the morality of killing their king and killing for king and country that was to follow the First World War. In Victorian Britain, it was a marvelous game. War was a marvelous game, the greatest game of all. Quote, the clash of sword and battle, end quote. Winston Churchill in South Africa as a soldier correspondent wrote of troops moving up to the lines, quote, a ceaseless living stream, and before them a guiding star, the red gleam of war, end quote. Editors were quick to arouse public demand for news of the fight against the rebellious Boers, and they spent freely to get the best possible coverage. The Times had 20 correspondents at one stage and carried excerpts from the official dispatches as well. All the stars of the craft headed south to write about a war that was expected to last only weeks. They included Dr. Conan Doyle, who was expected to last only who combined the organizing of field hospitals with the spot of patriotic descriptive writing, not up to his Sherlock Holmes level. Bennett Burleigh of the Daily Telegraph, interested not in the issues, but in getting yet another scoop. Angus Hamilton of the Times, a conscientious journalist who gave up the frustrating business of trying to tell the truth. Richard Harding Davis, who criticized the cavalier attitude of the British to the killing of Boers, and as a result was expelled from his London club. George Warrington Stevens, who had made his name in the Sudan. Julian Ralph of Collier's and the Daily Mail, an uncritical Anglophile. A.B. Banjo Patterson, an Australian poet who wrote poor jingoist verse modeled on Kipling's, and Kipling himself, worried at the early successes of the wily Boers and their leader Kruger. Cruel in the shadow, crafty in the sun. They had much to report. This was the first time since the Crimean War that the British Army was fighting other white men, and crude farmers, though the Boers might be, certain standards had to be maintained. No native troops were to be used, and under all circumstances a high level of behavior was expected. Soon correspondents were able to send back reports of the pluck, grit, and fighting qualities of the chivalry known on the battlefield, and above all, of the absolutely splendid way the British officers were dying. There was General Penn Simmons, who had ignored warnings of the danger of standing on a hill to get a better view at the Battle of Talana. Simmons suddenly turned to his aide-de-camp and said, with the utmost calm, "I am severely, mortally wounded in the stomach." A perfectly accurate statement, and he died soon afterward. There was Colonel G.E. Benson, who developed a successful system of surprise attack that involved forced night marches. With 178 of his men, Benson was overrun in a fight at Bakenlacht and lost 161 dead or wounded. He refused medical attention for himself until his men had been treated, and then died, murmuring to his second in command, "We shall no more night marching. It's all day now. Goodbye. God bless you." Stories like these sent a thrill through the empire, and the Morning Post correspondent, F.D. Bailey, was able to write, apparently with no trace of embarrassment, quote, "It is a good thing to be an Englishman. These foreigners start too quick and finish quicker," end quote. Another Morning Post correspondent in South Africa, Winston Churchill, then 25 years old, held similar views. Although Churchill had gone to South Africa as a war correspondent, he was a most unusual one, in that his main aim was not to report the war, but to push on with the campaign of, quote, self-advertisement, end quote, about which he had been so blatant in the Sudan. He had offered the Reuters correspondent his story of the charge of Lancers at Omdurman on the condition that Reuters mentioned his name. And using an offer from the Daily Mail as a bargaining point, he dictated terms to his friend Oliver Borthwick of the Morning Post and settled on £1,000 for 4 months, plus £200 a month for any longer period, all expenses, and the option to retain copyright of his dispatches. Remarkably generous terms. But from the beginning, Churchill was unable to make up his mind whether he was primarily a soldier or a reporter. Offered the chance of going on a British armored train, he ignored a fellow correspondent's advice that he was being paid to report the war, not fight it, and went because, quote, "I have a feeling, a sort of intuition, that if I go, something will come of it," end quote. When the train was ambushed, he took an active part in directing the action against the Boers. He had, as he later freely admitted in his own account of the action, quote, "taken with me, correspondent status notwithstanding, my Mauser pistol," end quote. And he would have fired on the Boer who captured him had he not left the pistol on the side of the engine. "I thought that I could kill this man, and after the treatment I had received, I earnestly desired to do so. I put my hand on the belt, and my pistol was not there." Now, it is not unusual for any war correspondents of this period to go armed, but doing so in South Africa, Churchill was risking both his life, and the Boers would, on his own evidence, have been justified in shooting him out of hand, and the non-combatant status of other correspondents. Churchill lied to the Boers, claiming that he had taken no part in the armored train action, so they eventually decided to treat him as a non-combatant, but, the most devastating irony of the affair, he escaped the day before the news of this decision reached his jailers. He made his way to Lourenço Marques, from where, on December 21st, 1899, he sent to the Morning Post his famous dispatch, quote, "I am very weak, but I am free. I have lost many pounds, but I am lighter in heart. I shall also avail myself of every opportunity from this moment to urge earnestness in an unflinching and uncompromised prosecution of the war," end quote. Now he persuaded General Sir Redvers Buller to give him a lieutenant's commission in the South African Light Horse, and, in contravention of a War Office ruling that no man should be both correspondent and soldier, he also persuaded the general to allow him to carry out both jobs. So in spite of criticism, in the Western in the Westminster Gazette, Mr. Churchill's non-combatancy is indeed a mystery, but one thing is clear. He cannot have the best of both worlds. And that was just what Churchill succeeded in doing, to the anger and disgust of other correspondents. As a soldier, he rode with his irregulars and showed his mother, Lady Randolph Church, around the front. As a correspondent, he followed the troops, using a wagon with a raised floor. Underneath rested a 2-foot layer of the best tinned provisions and alcoholic stimulants London could provide, and wrote some very not accurate dispatches. All the while he was, quote, searching in the carelessness of youth for every scrap of adventure, experience, or copy, end quote. He compiled a book, London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, from his reports, and successfully demanded an advance of £2,000. On his return to Britain, he went on a lecture tour, receiving £100 a night. He later extended the tour to the United States and Canada, so that when it all ended, he calculated he had made from his South African adventure no less than £10,000. How does Churchill finally emerge? There's little doubt that much of the criticism of him at the time was motivated by envy. He wrote statements about the war that few wanted to hear. It is foolish not to recognize that we are fighting a formidable and terrible adversary. The individual Boer mounted in suitable country is worth from 3 to 5 regular soldiers. Although he was usually indifferent to Boer casualties, we had a good bag today. 10 killed, 17 wounded. He did, on one occasion, recognize the futility of it all. He had seen a dead Boer, a gray-haired officer, clutching a letter from his wife, lying next to a 17-year-old boy shot through the heart. Ah, horrible war, he wrote. Amazing medley of the glorious and the squalid, the pitiful and the sublime. If modern men of light and leading saw your face closer, simple folk would see it hardly ever. His main shortcomings were his lust for publicity and his dual role as soldier-correspondent. His attitude to the war correspondent side of this split profession is best summed up in a statement he made during a House of Commons debate in 1944. Churchill, then Prime Minister, admitted that he had ordered stricter censorship of correspondence reports from Italy, and added, "Such words as desperate ought not to be used about the position in a battle when they are false. Still less should they have been used if they were true." An MP asked whether Churchill, as a former war correspondent, would not have fiercely resented a policy by which his reports were dictated by generals in the field. Churchill replied, "I should not have been allowed in South Africa, where I was a war correspondent for some time, to say, for instance, and the position in Ladysmith was desperate." Given these strictures, with which he obviously agreed, Churchill's reputation as a war correspondent in South Africa clicks into place. He saw South Africa through a soldier's eyes, and this inhibited him from all but general criticisms about the prosecution of the war. There was a lot to criticize. Years of cheap victories over natives had ill-prepared the British Army for an action against the intelligent and highly motivated enemy it found in South Africa. If the British Army staff had been of a higher caliber, it might have recognized earlier that the Boers could not be easily defeated by conventional methods, but the generals were at the best bumbling, and at the worst approaching lunacy. What are we to make of Kitchener, brought up in Ireland to sleep under newspapers because his father considered blankets unhealthy, the man who had looted the Mahdi's tomb and carried off the head in an old paraffin can as a trophy, a tactician with no idea of the nature of the Boers, savages with a white thin veneer, a general who collapsed and took to bed with his nerves all gone to pieces when told of a defeat. We are to decide about General Lord Frederick Roberts, the commander-in-chief in 1900, who packed up and went home saying the war was won and over, only to see it go on for another year and a half? And above all, what are we to make of Colonel Robert Baden-Powell, the hero of the siege of Mafeking? It is worth pausing at Baden-Powell and his siege because the legend that grew up around him represents one of the most serious failures on the part of the war correspondents in South Africa. Baden-Powell, when ordered to raise 2 regiments in Bechuanaland and Rhodesia to harass the enemy's rear and flank, marched his force instead into Mafeking, a small, dusty, tin-roofed town only 8 miles from the Transvaal border, and allowed the Boers to surround him, afterward saying he was prepared to, quote, sit tight, end quote. Communications, including the post and the telegraph, remained open during the 217-day siege, and Baden-Powell began sending out a series of plucky messages that caused shivers of admiration all over the empire. Even now, no one can accuse Baden-Powell of having lied in those dispatches. On the contrary, he stuck strictly to the truth. 1 or 2 small field guns shelling the town, nobody cares. Or, all well, for 4 hours bombardment, 1 dog killed. But a news-hungry public, desperate for reassurance after the war's early setbacks, took these literal truths as typical British stiff-upper-lip understatements, and the more casual, gay, and offhand Baden-Powell's dispatches became, the more the world believed that Mafeking must be suffering dreadfully. There were 5 war correspondents in Mafeking throughout most of the siege: Angus Hamilton of the Times, Emerson Neely of the Pall Mall Gazette, F.D. Bailey of the Morning Post, Veer Stent of Reuters, and E.G. Parslow of the Daily Chronicle. They could have told the truth about Mafeking in the earlier stages. Hamilton tried, his office ignored him. But once Baden-Powell's version had caught the public imagination, they decided that the myth was a better story than the facts and went wholeheartedly along with it. Yet what a story they could have written if they had had the courage. Baden-Powell came from one of those upper-middle-class English backgrounds where it's difficult to draw the line between eccentricity and psychosis. At school, at Charterhouse, he was known as, quote, old bathing towel, end quote. During service in India with the 13th Hussars, he specialized in pig-sticking, polo, musketry, drawing caricatures with his right or left hand, singing comic songs, and playing practical jokes. When the siege at Mafeking was underway, he utilized these talents to maintain morale. He organized cricket on Sundays, which scandalized the devout Boers, ran sports carnivals, was a judge at a baby show, captained a polo team, acted in sketches, recited and sang, ran a billiards tournament, dressed up as a circus ringmaster in a white tie and tails, wielded a whip nearly 30 feet long. He carried this make-believe world over into his military operations. Through a megaphone, he shouted orders to non-existent troops about non-existent attacks on the enemy lines, and squads of men were made to walk around the perimeter of the town, pretending to get through imaginary wire fences. He marked out non-existent minefields and ordered his men to parade with homemade lances carried against the skyline to make the Boers think reinforcements had arrived. He sent out fake signals for the Boers to capture and constantly invited them to surrender. He was an obsessive whistler and kept up his own morale by warbling operatic airs and music hall ditties from morning to night. Only the incompetence of the besieging force prevented the town from being overrun, and Baden-Powell's theatricals from being ended forever. The Boers' shells were either duds or ineffective, and when they themselves attacked, they never pressed home their advantage. Like Baden-Powell, they too decided to, quote, sit it out, end quote. There's evidence that Baden-Powell realized this. Early on, he called all the war correspondents together and told them he would not permit criticism of the conduct of the siege or of the officers, quote, because correspondents could not be conversant with all the facts on which to base their opinions, end quote. From then on, he censored their dispatches personally. Hamilton was able to get out a message, which the Time published on October 25, 1899, insisting on the smallness of the operation, but compared with Baden-Powell's crisp reports listing animal casualties and the state of Mafeking's morale, it was poor reader material and the public ignored it. Yet, while the correspondents dined each night, quote, with no small degree of luxury, end quote, and the officers sat down on Christmas Day to an 8-course meal that included oysters and sucking pig, the natives of Mafeking were starving. Baden-Powell had initiated a system of rationing for them, which involved their paying 3 pence for a pint bowl of horse meat soup. Few had enough money, and by the later stages of the siege, many were dying of hunger. Hamilton accused Baden-Powell of adopting a policy of starvation to drive the natives out of town, but he found the Times reluctant to use the story. And when it was suggested that the natives have a share of the white man's still plentiful rations, Baden-Powell issued an order that anyone hearing the idea repeated should, quote, apply the toe of the boot, end quote. Emerson Neely of the Pall Mall Gazette was so horrified of the conditions of the natives that he wrote a vivid descriptive piece, unfortunately not for his newspaper, but for a book, published when it was too late to be effective. I saw them fall down on the veldt and lie where they had fallen, too weak to go on their way. Words could not portray the scenes of misery. 500 or 600 human frameworks of both sexes and all ages, from tender infant upwards, standing in illness, awaiting turn to crawl painfully to the soup kitchen, where the food was distributed. Having obtained the horse soup, fancy them tottering off a few yards and sitting down to wolf up the life-fastening mass. They fed like outcast curs. They went farther than the mongrel. Day after day I heard outside my door continuous thumping sounds. They were caused by the living skeletons who, having eaten all that was outside the bones, smashed them up with stones and devoured what marrow they could find. They looked for bones in the dust heaps and the roads, everywhere. But the evidence is that a correspondent determined enough could have got a dispatch like that through enemy lines and back to his editor. A Reuters correspondent, J.E. Pearson, rode from Cape Town into Mafeking, had a look around, and then rode out again. His plan to do so regularly went astray. On his way back to Cape Town, he sent off a message to Baden-Powell by pigeon, which, instead of flying to Mafeking, landed in a Boer camp, where it was shot and Pearson's incriminating message captured. Hallowell, the correspondent of the Daily Mail, rode in and, quote, besieged, end quote, Mafeking for 2 months, getting his cables away regularly, until finally the Boers captured him. Churchill's aunt, Lady Sarah Wilson, the heroine of heroic admiration for her, quote, splendid pluck, end quote, became the Daily Mail's correspondent in Mafeking, and succeeded in getting her stories out without much trouble. She even managed to receive a letter from Cecil Rhodes, besieged in Kimberley, which does not say much for the Boer, quote, ring of steel, end quote, around both towns. When it became clear that the war was not going to be over quickly, the division of opinion in Britain became deeper. Ranged against the war were a Stop the War Committee, W.T. Stead in his famous pamphlet, Shall I Slay My Brother Boer? The Liberal leader Lloyd George, quote, the war is an outrage perpetrated in the name of human freedom, end quote, and the Manchester Guardian, the Morning Leader, and the Star. The fact that the nation was not wholeheartedly behind them caused some bitterness among the troops, so the government did everything it could to mobilize public opinion for Queen and country. This involved encouraging racialism and jingoism in their most virulent forms, and creating animosity against the enemy with the timeless ploy of the atrocity story. In both these fields, the newspapers, the church, and the war correspondents played their part. The Times wrote leaders peppered with phrases like the common man of the empire, or the fundamental grit of the breed, or the unanalyzable qualities that have made the empire. This was to be expected. The Times had lost any claim to be able to view the issues objectively after the involvement of some of its staff in the Jameson raid, a plot to overthrow Kruger. Only very suspect testimony before a parliamentary select committee saved the paper from being totally compromised. L.S. Amory, its chief correspondent in South Africa, was not unsympathetic to the Boers. He spoke Afrikaans and was even an authorized correspondent with the Boer forces until General Petrus Joubert, their commander, threw him out, but he was only concerned with the war's effect on Britain and warned that what was occurring was the greatest political event in the history of the British Empire since the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars. Kipling, in South Africa, working on The Friend, an army newspaper run by 4 war correspondents in Bloemfontein, wrote his, quote, Song of the White Man, end quote, a stronger version of, quote, The White Man's Burden, end quote, with its demand for freedom or war. The church in Britain contributed a poem of dreadful rhyme and jingoist sentiment about a 14-year-old bugler who lost his bugle at Tugela, and the Dean of St. Paul's spoke of the breed of Englishmen with its traditional tenacity and stubborn pluck. While these were at their worst, the Queen said, I will have no depression in my house. The editor of the Daily Chronicle was dismissed for failing to reflect the patriotic sentiment of his readers. Punch showed a drawing of a baby saying his first word, bang, and Thomas Cook and Sons advertised a tour of the battlefields. The jingoists had their finest day when Mafeking was relieved. Reuters flashed the news to London at 9:17 p.m. on May 18, 1900, and British went mad. The celebrations lasted for 5 nights and surpassed the victory celebrations of the First and Second World Wars in size, intensity, and enthusiasm. Baden-Powell became the most popular English hero since Nelson, and a household name not only in Britain but throughout also the United States. In the field, war correspondents could not help but sense the mood for the home front. This was obviously no time for debunking heroes, exposing incompetence, or describing the horrors of war. They wrote of a dog following its master into battle and staying by his body when he fell, of lucky escapes, of gallant charges and heroic retreats. Our indomitable soldiers walked erect and straight onward, wrote Burleigh. Not Rome in her palmiest days ever possessed more devoted sons. As the gladiators marched proud and beaming to meet death, so the British soldiers, doomed, saluted, and then, with alacrity, stepped forward to do their duty. Glory o'er the grave. The grave it frequently was. The British trenches at the Spion Kop were piled with British dead, 3 deep and more. An acre of massacre, J.B. Atkins, Russell's biographer, wrote later. But photographs showing the slaughter, caused by a staff blunder, were not published in Britain because the newspapers considered them, quote, revolting Boer propaganda, end quote, and the correspondents played down the extent of British casualties. The Boers, in their turn, were also slaughtered. In a raid, British troops overran a Boer trench, bayoneting the defenders or decapitating them with the sword. Only one correspondent, Emerson Neely of the Pall Mall Gazette, wrote about the important elements of the affair, and he excused it. The work was generally held by boys who, of course, had to take their chance with the men in the massacre. It's not too much to taste your soldier to bayonet of a lad 13 or 14, but if any shame attaches to the killing of the youngsters, it must rest on those of the fathers who brought them there. No war correspondent reported at the time that some 300 Australian troops had mutinied because a British officer had told them that they were, quote, a lot of wasters and white-livered curs, end quote. And the story did not come out until the Australian government intervened to get the mutineers pardoned instead of hanged. No one exposed that many of the troops coming out from Britain could neither ride nor shoot, and the scandal of military hospitals that had no bandages, no cots, no sheets, no pillows, no measuring glasses, and no thermometers was revealed by British war correspondents, not by them, but by a British MP, William Burdett Coutts, and on an Australian correspondent, A.G. Hales. Kipling was so angry about the state of military hospitals that he landed a hand cart with bad bandages and delivered them to the hospital in Cape Town, only to be told that army regulations prohibited the assistance of supplies from an individual. Kipling dumped the bandages on the hospital doorstep. Hales wrote of, quote, criminal neglect of the most simple laws of sanitation, end quote, and described camps where no latrines were dug and no supervision exercised over the men's health. The so-called medical staff looked on, Hales wrote, and puffed their cigarettes and talked under their eyeglasses. Burdett Coutts had experience in military hospital administration in the Russo-Turkish War as a special commissioner for the Turkish Compassionate Fund. Hearing rumors of the poor conditions of South Africa, he went out there in January 1900 to see for himself how British sick and wounded were being cared for. He was so shocked that he wrote for the Times a series of highly critical articles, including one on June 27th, in which he said that the men were, quote, dying like flies for want of adequate attention, end quote. On his return, he took up the matter in Parliament and was successful in having a royal commission appointed. The commissioners reported that Burdett Coutts' strictures were justified and that the Army Medical Corps was, quote, wholly insufficient in staff and equipment for such a war, end quote. As a result of poor sanitation and primitive hospital facilities, of the 22,000 men the British lost in the war, 14,000 died of sickness rather than from enemy action, a shocking indictment of the medical corps and of the correspondents who failed to expose its inadequacies. True, the correspondents worked under harsh and repressive censorship. One censor used to throw correspondence dispatches straight into the wastepaper bin without bothering to read them, and the chief censor told one of them, "There is only one thing I will allow you to write today, a description of the new Union Jack, which has just been run up over headquarters." Burley wrote bitter stories about censorship, only to see them cut to pieces and criticism struck out. The point about censorship is that while it can prevent a correspondent from sending a story the military does not want published, it cannot force him to send a false or exaggerated one. Yet, throughout the latter stages of the war, the British press carried a stream of reports from its correspondents of Boers murdering wounded men, massacring pro-British civilians, flogging natives, and executing Boers who wanted to surrender. Since, in most cases, the stories contain little evidence to support the charges, an artist would be employed to render a highly realistic version of the atrocity. There is virtually no limit to such invention, and in early newsreel film shown to British audiences depicts a Red Cross tent under fire from the Boers, while brave British doctors, nurses, and orderlies try to treat a wounded soldier. The film was a fake shot with actors on Hampstead Heath, a suburb of London. Some correspondents went too far. Edgar Wallace, who had gone out to South Africa as a medical orderly, had then succeeded Julian Rolfe as the Daily Mail's correspondent, wrote such vivid atrocity stories on such flimsy evidence that the British government told him to tone down his reporting. The Mail could have argued that Wallace was merely keeping pace with those atrocity stories appearing in European newspapers, like the Tribunal de Genève, which claimed that Kipling, on an assignment with the Burleigh, had taken part in the murder of a civilian near Currie Siding, or the Vienna Neue Presse, which regularly carried anti-British stories. The anti-Boer atrocity should be set against the Times history of the war, published in 1906, when passions had cooled a little. It said, quote, "In the moment of their triumph, the Boers behaved with the same unaffected kind-heartedness which they had displayed after most of their victories. Although exultant, they were not insulting. They fetched water and blankets for the wounded and treated prisoners with every consideration." End quote. British concentration camps were a different matter. Kitchener's policy of burning the farms of Boers who had broken their parole not to fight again, or who had supplied or harbored fighting men, left him with the problem of accommodating homeless women and children. He decided to intern them, along with the women and children of all Boers who were on commando. It is likely he would have caused less trouble for himself if he had left them all where they were to fend for themselves as best they could. Instead, he packed them into tents and camps, apparently not realizing the difficulties he was creating. The crowded tents, foul water, shortage of clothes, lack of proper sanitary facilities in the heat, and an outbreak of measles sent the death rate soaring. At Bloemfontein, the figure was 383 per 1,000 adults and 500 per 1,000 children. It now became safer to be in the Boer army than to be a citizen. This was one story any war correspondent worth his passage should have written. Instead, it was left to Emily Hobhouse, a Quaker, who was the leader of the South African Coalition Committee. In a report to members of Parliament, she described conditions in the camp she had visited as, "A 6-month-old baby is gasping its life out on its mother's knees. Next tent, a child recovering from measles sent back from hospital before it could walk, stretched on the ground, white and wan. Next, a girl of 21 lay dying on a stretcher. The father, kneeling beside her while his wife was watching a child of 6 also dying, and one of about 5 dropping. Already this couple had lost 3 children." The leader of the opposition, Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, raised the matter in the House of Commons and spoke of Britain's, quote, "methods of barbarism," end quote. The German newspaper snapped up the story, referring with relish to the British Honden in South Africa, but many British newspapers were quick to justify Kitchener's actions. The St. James Gazette wrote, "Women and children are frequently employed to carry messages. Of course they must be included in military measures and transported or dispatched. We have undertaken to conquer the Transvaal, and if nothing makes sure except the removal of the Dutch inhabitants, they must be removed, men, women, and children." Kitchener defended himself with, "The inmates are far better looked after in every way than they are in their own homes," end quote. In spite of all this, the government had to appoint a commission of inquiry and eventually carried out reforms. The Boers were less interested in capitalizing on the exposure of British concentration camps. They rather liked the idea that their enemy had to expend rations and supplies in this manner, rather than in the possibility that the British might arm the natives against them. an enormous act, the wickedness of which no one can foresee. British policy in this respect was in line with the Boers. Having only recently clashed with armed Zulus, they too saw the danger of their position in Africa if the natives, instead of remaining spectators in battles fought on their territory, decided to take part. With few exceptions, correspondents ignored these wider issues. One exception was Richard Harding Davis, who felt that imperialism's days were numbered and that the Boers, fighting against odds for their independence, deserved to have their case and their struggle reported. He loved England, and despite his views, might have remained with the British troops, but trouble with the censor convinced him that he should join the Boers. From Pretoria, he wrote, "As I see it, has been a holy war, this burgher crusade, and their motives are as fine as that called a Minuteman from his farm or sent a Knight of the Cross to die in Palestine." This caused much offence in Britain and cost Davis membership in his London club as well as many friends. George Warrington Stevens wrote a good description of the aftermath of battle. "In the rain-blared light of the lantern, the doctor, the one doctor, toiled buoyantly on, cutting up clothes with scissors, feeling the light, firm fingers over torn chest or thigh, cunningly slipping round the bandage, tenderly covering up the crimson ruin of strong men. Hour by hour, man by man, he toiled on." Burleigh, though sometimes flowery, was frank when he could avoid the censor. When the British army steamed into Ladysmith, he rushed to the telegraph and persuaded the operator to send him a message beginning, "We are beaten, and it means investment. We shall all be locked up." End quote. Unlike other correspondents, Burleigh could see no sense in remaining in Ladysmith for the siege, and while the others were keeping diaries, which they later published to a world soon bored by the volume after volume of recollections, Burleigh joined Lord Roberts on the Western Campaign and managed to get a scoop on the peace talks. The rest of the correspondents either were crushed by censorship, joined the Atrocities Campaign, or were incompetent and wrote nonsense. The Daily Mail said at one stage that the Boers were determined to have Kruger crowned at Westminster. They contradicted each other. The reader could believe either that, quote, "the Boers are running short of ammunition," end quote, or "the Boers are stated on good authority to have ammunition in stores for at least 5 years," end quote. And when they had to explain why the war, they said, would be over quickly, was dragging bloodily on, they blamed the easiest target, the wily Boer with his unsporting guerrilla tactics. The honest, straightforward, upright in battle Englishman had been foiled by a cunning colonial. "Everywhere the slimy, slippery ranchers and tavern keepers and merchants welcomed us with the heartiest of speech, and always we were fooled by it," Julian Ralph wrote. "Half the people or more in that great region were out on commando. No man except a pro-Boer or born Boer could have been anywhere we found these double-faced people with their Judas-like pretense of friendship. It was self-evident that they must have been siding with our enemies. We were fooled! Fooled! Fooled!" Britain was fooled, but it was her own fault. She never had a full and accurate picture of what was happening in South Africa. The correspondents blamed the military for this, claiming that censorship kept the public ignorant. The military blamed the correspondents and the public. "The interest of the general public in a narrative of a campaign is unfortunately in inverse ratio to historical value." There is little doubt that the Boer War offered correspondents a remarkable opportunity. They could have seen that the imposition of imperial rule requires an ever-increasing amount of force, and that when this force is faced with a determined nationalist sentiment, the point must eventually be reached at which the expending of it is no longer worth the return. They could have reached the success in an unorthodox military strategy, guerrilla warfare. The Boer, neither completely civilian nor completely a soldier, alternating between tending his farm and fighting the British, lightly armed with an accurate repeating rifle, mobile, able to live for long periods on strips of dried meat and a little water, drawing on the hidden support of his countrymen, unafraid to flee when the battle was not in his favor, choosing his ground and his time for attack, was more a match for any regular army, no matter what its strength. Kitchener's policy of retaliation, with its farm burning and concentration camps and collective punishment, was as ineffective as a similar policy employed in Vietnam 65 years later. The political importance of the war was underestimated. Only now are its errors and tragedies reaching full realization, and despite the swarms of war correspondents and military observers from nearly every major power in the world, the main military lessons of the war went unnoticed. The British soldier learned from the values of the accurate rifle fire, but only the conclusions drawn from Boers' use of trenches proved to be false ones. James Barnes, an American war correspondent, saw the truth that trenches too long to be outflanked would lead to stalemate, but he thought this too obvious a point to drive home, and he wrote with certainty that trench warfare was a thing of the past, except in wooded country or where all preliminary movements are concealed. Events were soon to prove how wrong he was. That's the end of that chapter. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. If you have any friends that like history, I'll be reading more about it. And please let them know.